Hello, Rebecca. Welcome, welcome.
Hi, Bolutiwi. Thank you.
Well, it's
Nice
so
to
good.
see you.
Well, nice to see you too. It's so good to have you here today, and I cannot wait to dive into the theme for today, which is your brain on fire. And
Mm.
when I saw that, my eyes nearly popped out of my head because I thought to myself, that resonates so much. But before we dive into this, I would, of course, like to introduce you. So,
Oh,
everyone who's listening, this awesome, amazing, phenomenal woman is a certified holistic nutritionist and naturopath. She's been studying food and natural medicine and spiritual healing over many years and combines her background in science and natural medicine to empower people to overcome chronic and mystery illness and heal naturally using food as medicine. Ever since she was a child, Rebecca was drawn to food, plants, and nature, and she later turned to this in search for answers to her own health symptoms. Through her own healing journey and work with clients, she gained a deep understanding of the body and the ways in which we can best reclaim our vitality. Music to my ears, by the way. Her greatest passion is teaching people how to use food as medicine in daily life and connecting them to the deep inner wisdom that food holds. Oof.
Thank you for the introduction. Beautiful.
Well, thank you for coming. I mean, this is incredible. So I'd love to dive right in. So
Yeah,
the theme, your brain on fire, really struck me. I was reading one of your newsletters, which are always fabulous, by the way.
thank
And
you.
people may ask, okay, the brain, you're not a neurologist, you are not a neurosurgeon, you are a naturopath and nutritionist. So why am I asking you about the brain? So what I would love for you to share is what does nutrition and naturopathy have to do with the brain?
Sure. Well, I mean, our brain is a central part of our central nervous system, right? Our brain is, a huge component of our being as human beings. Our brain is also where the soul resides, according to Anthony William, also known as the medical medium, whose work has been and is such a huge part of my journey, my healing journey and my work that I now do with clients. This has formed a very prominent part of the work that I do. The sharing of his information. So he's just written a new book called Brain Saver, which is completely mind-blowingly phenomenal. And I confess that the "your brain is on fire" terminology is from his book. It's not my terminology. um so yes, I mean, the brain is such a huge component of who we are as human beings. You can't separate it from who we are and from the body when we're talking about health, and when we're talking about the soul as well.
I love that because it just also tells everyone who's listening that in terms of your brain, there is a proactive approach to keeping it optimized, to healing it. And it's not
Absolutely.
only about medicine and, surgery. It's really about lifestyle choices, which begin with the food we put into our bodies. And so you mentioned that beautiful phrase again. What does it mean, your brain on fire? What
Yeah,
exactly what
sure.
does it mean?
Sure. I mean, I also just want to state that, if you're, if your brain is not functioning properly, you're not functioning properly, right? So it's so completely essential that we're looking after this part of our central nervous system, part of our bodies. So when I'm talking about your brain on fire, we're talking about the what happens in the brain. So the brain has an electrical field that's operating at all times, and as part of that sort of electricity that's running through the brain, heat will be created. That's part of how it works. But that heat is not meant to be sustained for long periods of time. It's meant to be sort of short, sharp flashes of heat. And there are things in place within the body, within the brain, that help to keep the brain cool so that it's not sustaining that heat. So, for example, there's space between the skull and the brain. There's also the cerebrospinal fluid, which contains magnesium and water, for example, and then there's glucose in the brain. And those three factors are almost like safeguarding mechanisms that help to keep the brain cool. But what can happen is that intense emotional experiences can hit the brain quite hard and create a lot of heat. And if those intense emotional experiences are sort of above and beyond what the brain can handle, then it causes damage to the brain tissue. It scorches the brain tissue, and it causes neurotransmitters, which are like the body's way of sending messages in the central nervous system in the body. They start to burn out. And this is what we sort of call brain on fire. But there's another component to that, and the other component is heavy metals, because heavy metals, which we're all exposed to in the world in very, very high volumes, get into the brain, and they sit in sort of, deposits in the brain, and they alone can create a lot of heat. So when you then have an intense emotional experience and you have heavy metals, then you've got double whammy of heat. And what the metals will do is cause the heat that's produced as a result of the emotional experience. The heavy metals will actually cause the brain to hold on to it for longer. So you're creating this sort of intense fire that's going on for a longer period of time than it should. So in this respect, it's important for us, on the one hand, to be level with our emotions, to do our emotional healing, so that we're not being, highly reactive, triggered into highly reactive states, so that we're keeping things calm. And on the other hand, it's super important that we're clearing out the toxic heavy metals. And it's almost like those two have to go hand in hand, because if you're doing your emotional healing, for example, and you're not at the same time clearing out the heavy metals on a regular basis, then there is the capacity for the brain to just go back to how it was, for the patterning to go back to how it was. So you could spend, all this money and seeing beautiful practitioners doing all of this rewiring and repatterning of your brain. But if you've got metals in there that are creating havoc, then all of that work can be undone quite quickly, because one of the things that heavy metals do is that they disrupt the electrical circuiting of the brain. So you literally rewire things, and the heavy metals can cause it to rewire the other way, if you like. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. In fact, it's fascinating, because what I'm hearing you say is that, first of all, through emotional stressors, let's put it that way, and it'll be different for everyone. Some things that may stress me and may not stress another person, but whatever's stressing me, I'm creating emotional overwhelm, let's put it that way, is definitely affecting that heat in the brain. That's number one.
Yeah.
That goes on for long periods of time without respite. You actually said it causes the neurotransmitters to burn out. So we'll go to that in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
In addition to that, we're all in a world that is toxic. I actually sent out a newsletter the other day about toxicity. And heavy metals is just one of the toxins that we expose.
For sure.
And you're saying that the heavy metals is not some airy-fairy term, that we actually have deposits of heavy metal in our brain, which is one of the most important of organs. I mean, without it, we have any quality of life whatsoever. And so first of all, let's just talk a little bit about the emotional stresses. So let's assume I've had a stressful day, right? And I just keep having stressful days, right? And it's a continuous thing. How exactly does this impact my brain? And for example, I've heard about things like adaptogens. of course, good quality adaptogens. I'm not talking about just anything in the market. Does this,
Yeah.
because you mentioned something really, I can't remember the exact term you used, but you said something about keeping emotionally level. I think that's what you said. Right. So yeah, please
Yeah.
expand on that for 2 seconds.
Yeah, for sure. So, just to sort of, um, you know, pick apart what you're saying a bit. I mean, if we have a lot of emotional intensity, then we're producing a lot of adrenaline in the body. So not only is the brain being affected, the whole vagus nerve is being affected, the adrenals are being affected, and we're producing a lot of adrenaline, right? And it's the adrenaline that has this scorching effect on the body. So adrenaline, when it's, when there's too much adrenaline in the body coming from, what you might call negative sources or intense emotional experiences of a more negative kind as opposed to a more positive kind, then this type of adrenaline, because our body produces 56 different blends of adrenaline, which is, how mind-blowing is that, so the adrenals will produce the sort of the blend of adrenaline that the body needs in order to overcome this emotional experience. And it's the adrenaline that has this scorching effect. So then when we bring adaptogens into the picture, what adaptogens are doing is helping to, bring the body back into homeostasis, to create balance again. So yes, of course, we can use adaptogens for this purpose, absolutely, to help, level off the stress. But you have to remember that they're not necessarily getting to the root cause of the issue. We still have to get to the root cause of, well, what's creating the emotional reactivity, and how much of that is being influenced by heavy metals, because heavy metals on their own can create anger, sadness, frustration, inconsistency, the sort of going back to patterns time and time again. I mean, conditions like depression, bipolar, mania, these are OCD. These are conditions that are very, very rooted in heavy metals. They have a big heavy metals component to them. And even though there might also be emotional trauma related to these conditions, there is also the toxicity piece. And the toxicity piece is huge. I mean, heavy metals we have been exposed to for many, many, many years, and when we inherit them from our ancestors. So not only are we dealing with very, very deep deposits of heavy metals, we're also dealing with heavy metals that we're then exposed to in this lifetime from birth, I might say, because the whole vaccination schedule has heavy metals in it. Dare I mention this topic, but kids, babies, tiny babies are exposed in that way from very, very early in life, so our exposure is big. And then, heavy metals are literally falling out of the sky. They're everywhere. They're in our food supply, herbicides and pesticides. They're in every single medication that exists. They're in our rain, so we're very, very heavily exposed. So we need to learn how to take action in order to keep moving them out of the body all the time. It's really, really important, because they are having such a big effect on humankind's neurological health. That's what I'm talking about, really, is the health of the nervous system. Yeah.
That's so amazing you mentioned that, because I was or listening to a podcast the other day, and what the person was saying was that we live in a toxic world, full stop. You will be exposed to toxins, full stop. It's not the option you have, as you just mentioned, is either proactively supporting your body in cleansing or not. Again, everybody's choice, right? It's like nobody's to do anything. So just going back to the heavy metals, I love the way you described really the relationship between stressors, the different blends of adrenaline, because adrenaline is not the enemy, right? It actually is very useful sometimes. It just depends on what kind you are triggering into your system. And then said, no matter, let's even assume you become so beautifully zen, if you still have the heavy metal toxicity, then that will still on its own is capable of influencing your moods. I mean, I didn't realize that, by the way. So
Absolutely, absolutely, in a very big way, in a much bigger way, I think, than we realize, Yeah.
assuming I have heavy metal lodged in my brain, right? How can I get it out? First of all, is it possible to get it out properly? I
Yeah.
mean, at a real
Yeah.
level difference, not just, and in what way is this possible?
Yeah, well, this is where we rely on food. There's the heavy metal detox smoothie, which combines 5 key ingredients in order to uproot the heavy metals from the brain and from the body. And those 5 key ingredients are wild blueberries, top of the list as an adaptogen, by the way. Wild blueberries are probably the most adaptogenic food we have access to on the planet, in this world. So wild blueberries, coriander, which is an amazing heavy metal chelator, spirulina, barley grass juice powder, and dulse seaweed. So these 5 ingredients act almost like a football team from the brain all the way down to the rectum. And literally they pass heavy metals from one to the next, sweeping them out of the body. And this is beautiful because we can put those 5 ingredients together in an absolutely delicious smoothie called the Heavy Metal Detox Smoothie. And then that can be our means of removing heavy metals on a daily basis. I mean, obviously for people who have very high levels of heavy metals and have had big exposure, through the ancestral line and then also in this lifetime, it takes a bit of work to get these metals out of the body. I mean, I have no doubt I am still working through big loads of heavy metals in my system. I think back, I'll give you a really good example. I think back to my childhood, and I have felt for a long time that the vaccination schedule for me as a child was too intense for my body. It had a really big impact. And as a child, I did suffer from really bad OCD for several years. And yes, I can look back and say there were also stressors in my early life. There's no question. But I can also see the impact that heavy metals have had. And when I've then subsequently been doing a lot of work to move heavy metals out of my body and had sessions with healers who have been able to say to me, not with me asking, oh, you've been removing a lot of aluminium, for example, or you've been removing a lot of mercury, So these things are very real and they cause real problems, So if you have a child that is showing signs of OCD or behavioral issues, then obviously the emotional aspects need to be addressed, but so do the toxicity aspects, And if you can catch it in kids from an early age, this is ideal because they're more pliable, It's like you and the heavy metal detox smoothie can be used in young children, It's really amazing in that way. So yeah.
But I was just going to ask you that question. So that smoothie, it can be used for children as well. And I just also want to land something because you've mentioned vaccination a few times, and some people, it's just become such a political issue. It's almost like no one can.
Absolutely.
But what I just wanted to really land is, let's put vaccination aside. What are the other ways in which we expose ourselves constantly to heavy metals?
Yeah, well, like I mentioned before, through the food chain, herbicides and pesticides are laden with heavy metals. In our cookware, depending on what cookware we have, full of heavy metals. Aluminium foil, for example. Medications are a big one. In our rainwater, heavy metals coming from chemtrails in the sky is another big one. So yes, they are endemic. They are literally everywhere. There's no question. Yeah.
Absolutely, because you just mentioned aluminium foil, you just mentioned rainwater. So even if you're buying water in beautiful bottle and paying a lot for it, I mean that water is probably coming down and trickling down into, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, the only
And then
go on, please.
yeah, sorry, I was just going to say, just while you were talking, popped into my mind. The other big one is scented candles and fragrances. So perfumes, scented candles, scented sticks, any of these things are absolutely laden with heavy metals. So it's really, really important that, you know, we're taking caution with these things. Yeah.
That's not good. So let me just be clear about what you just said. Any
Yeah.
candle. So there are no
Any
candles.
scented candle.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, you know, unless a scented candle is, you know, when I say scented candles, I'm talking about synthetically scented candles. You know, there's very few candles that you get that are made from, you know, completely natural ingredients. Some, you know, you can get candles that are made with essential oils, for example. That's different. If you're buying synthetically, so-called natural synthetically scented candles, then they will contain a lot of heavy metals.
Okay, so Rebecca, first thing, I'm going to be asking you for your recommendation of nice smelling candles metals, because that's a must. I love scented candles. So it'll
Well, there you
be
go.
solution, right?
Yeah,
Oh my
yeah,
goodness. I did not know
yeah.
that. So
Take
thank you.
notes. Take notes. Yeah.
Noted, engraved. Wow. So let me just recap. Brain on fire. There is the emotional triggers, which sends whatever blend of adrenaline to your body, basically fries it if it's too intense over a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And there are also the, as you said, endemic exposure to heavy metals.
Mm-hmm.
So for anybody who really is serious about brain health, there is the learning to regulate your nervous system, because the exposure to stress is not going to stop, is it? It is what it is. It's your internal regulation that would change. So that's number one. But the number two, maybe three things: the adaptogens you can take to support you with that, but also
Yeah.
at the same time, two things about the heavy metals: reducing your exposure would be smart, but also really detoxifying, using, for example, this is just one method, the the heavy metal detox smoothie you just mentioned, which seems quite easy. I mean, I've tried it myself, and it's actually very delicious, as a means of, you know, eliminating and supporting your system in cleansing.
Yeah.
Because I mean, we both know the body cleanses naturally. The problem is if you're adding the toxins faster than the body was made to cleanse. That's where the problem lies, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we were not built to deal with the levels of toxic exposure that we have in the world today. And most people's bodies cannot keep up. Like the poor liver is, you know, on a hamster wheel with trying to keep up with all it has to contend with. So, you know, I would say that yes, it's true that of course the body is detoxing all of the time. That's the role of the liver, for example, but it needs a helping hand. And one of the ways that we give it a helping hand is by giving it the right ingredients, the right fuel, which is really the healing foods. We you know, we can refer to the healing foods as fruits, vegetables, herbs and spices, and wild foods. And the reason why that's important is because these are the foods that contain glucose and mineral salts, which is what the body runs on. And this is really important when it comes to brain health, because what the brain is asking for is more glucose and more mineral salts. But if we have a very high fat, high protein diet, then that's going to block the uptake of the glucose and the mineral salts into where it needs to go, into all of the cells and into the brain. So trace minerals are an interesting one. When I talk about trace minerals, I'm talking about, you know, in particular, all the minerals that we get from celery juice, for example, leafy greens, you know, sprouts, cucumber. All of these foods have a very, very rich level of mineral salts in them. And those trace minerals are, how Anthony describes it in his book, they're what connect us not only to our own soul, but they contain information. These trace minerals contain information that connect us to everything beyond this earth. So ultimately, they are what connect us to God, to the stars, to the moon, to the other planets. And I just think that's so beautiful, you know. So these trace minerals in plant foods contain an intelligence that is way beyond the intelligence of our minds, of what we can fathom. And the more of these trace minerals that we eat, the more it opens up our brain, it opens up our connection to our soul. So, when we're talking about health and healing, we're not just talking about the physical components here. We're talking about using food as a medicine to open up and pull apart your inner being so that you can connect at a higher level. Yeah.
I really love that, because there's this French philosopher who has this quote, and I never remember his name, but it was something along the lines of, we're spiritual beings having a human experience.
Yeah.
And if you take it from that angle, then indeed, if we're spiritual beings having a human experience, then of course, nutrition is not only about keeping ourselves alive or surviving, it's definitely about being a spiritual being and keeping that connection alive. So you mentioned trace minerals. What are the trace minerals, for example?
Well, trace minerals would be things like copper, good copper that we need would be like manganese, boron, magnesium, sodium. These are all essential trace minerals that the body needs. And that's, people get confused because copper is also regarded as a heavy metal, for example. So this is different. Heavy metals are naturally occurring elements, but when those naturally occurring elements are taken and used in industry, they get transformed or deformed, which makes them unrecognizable and unusable or harmful to the body. So the natural small amounts of copper, well, not such small amounts, the natural amounts of copper that we're getting through our food, we get plenty of copper through our food, by the way, that's absolutely fine. It's usable. The body knows what to do with it. But if we're taking in copper from, copper pipes or copper pots that we're cooking with, or copper cookware, plates, for example, then this is dangerous because it's been transformed. It's not usable. And this is what we would consider, it's now a heavy metal. And that's what can get lodged in the brain and different parts of the body and cause trouble.
Wow.
Yeah. Does
Really,
that make sense?
absolutely, absolutely. And I think it also touches the point about the quote, we are what we eat, right? And we all know,
Yeah.
anybody who's gone on a fast before, or anybody who's, switched from junk food and just eating healthier, can feel the difference in your energy field. It's you feel it,
Absolutely.
right? And so,
Absolutely.
of course, when some people say when they're on fast and have fasted for long period of time, they're more spiritually awake and aware. So I can relate to what you're saying, definitely. Now, when we talk about nootropics, which is something quite new for me, because we're talking about the brain, and the brain is not just there because it's the brain. You want your brain to function properly, right?
Mm-hmm.
You want the neurons to be wiring and firing optimally, where you're not like, what was I thinking again? Or in my case, exactly, getting into situations where I'd really be very intense about something, and I'd actually feel like my brain had literally frozen. I could feel it like going, oh,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
it stopped. That was interesting.
Yeah.
So what's your take on, you've mentioned adaptogens, so what's your take on nootropics, and in what way can they support us in terms of, instead of having our brains on fire in a way that is negative, having our brains on fire in a way where it's on point?
Sure. So can you give me an example of the nootropics that you're talking about? Because, if you Google nootropics, for example, caffeine falls into the category of being a nootropic, but that's not helpful for our brain health in the longer term. It might give you intense focus and energy in that moment, but what it's doing actually is just pushing adrenaline into the body and sending you into overdrive and taxing the adrenals and burning out neurotransmitters in the brain in the longer term. So this is not helpful. Then there's also green tea. So green tea contains L-theanine, for example, which does help to calm the body down. But if we use just green tea, then it's also producing a lot of adrenaline in the body. So it really depends on what we're talking about, and the kind of So you need to give me a few examples of nootropics that you have in mind.
I love that. So
If, if, if
how about we do this? So what I'm even hearing, which I wasn't quite aware of, I didn't realize that coffee or caffeine fell under that category. So what I'm now hearing from you, you say that there's an array of nootropics, from the maybe not so helpful to the, let's say, preferable. So, and thanks for presenting that point about coffee falling into that. So what kind of nootropics would you, first of all, maybe you can just explain to people listening, what's a nootropic? Number one, what are we talking about? It's not mushrooms or drugs, I can assure everyone. So what is it? And if one was choosing between this, what would you then recommend? Maybe that would be a better.
Sure. Well, nootropics is not an area that I'm wholly familiar with. And, there's nootropics, like, for example, in the category of nootropics, there are natural herbs, but there are also synthetic drugs that are falling into that category. So there's sort of different classifications going on. And I'm not an expert by any means. Where I would have more knowledge is around the adaptogens. So if we look at something like Siberian ginseng, for example, or Panax ginseng, that's considered to be both a nootropic and also an adaptogen. So these are herbs, these are natural herbs that are amazing for helping to recalibrate the body. So Siberian ginseng, Panax ginseng, as I mentioned, ashwagandha, reishi mushroom, for example. These are beautiful adaptogens that can probably also fall under the category of being nootropics. And also, plants that grow closer to home, like dandelion, for example, echinacea. These can also be considered adaptogens. Any plant that grows in an area, often these plants will grow in areas where there's sort of high stress, and yet they thrive. And those are the plants that we often would refer to as being adaptogens, because they thrive under stress. Then when we take them into our body, they are able to help us regulate our systems better.
Very clear. And in terms of, let's say I'm a busy person, right? And I really want to make sure that I'm protecting my brain, right? I'm healing my brain. So let's even talk about healing, first of all, because I think many of us probably would benefit from some sort of healing in that respect, and then protecting going forwards. What are 3 things you would recommend I stop doing?
You stop doing or you start doing?
Stop doing.
Right. Okay. Stop having caffeine, whether it's through coffee, green tea, chocolate, matcha, you name it. That's going to interfere with your healing process. Stop eating so many fats, such a high fat, high protein diet, because that's going to hinder the glucose and mineral salts from getting into your brain in an effective way. And stop eating junk food and processed food if that's what you're doing.
I love that. So let's go to the high fats, high protein. So when you say high fats, high protein, do you mean the proportion? So if you're having fats and protein and you're not having enough vegetables, is that what you mean? Or are you actually talking about the reductions of fat and the reductions of protein? Which is it?
Yeah, well, just to clarify, high protein foods are also high in fat. So a lean chicken is still a high fat food. So when I say high fat, high protein, they are one and the same.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So one needs to always be looking at how much fat am I eating in a day, and how much, and is that serving my health? Because the liver can only tolerate so much fat. Every time you put fat in the body, the liver has to produce bile to break it down. And depending on the health of the liver, people's capacity to process fats will be different. But as human beings, we're not really made to be consuming large amounts of fat and protein on a daily basis. The body, we have to keep looking back to what the body runs on. It runs on glucose and mineral salts, but we also get enough fat and protein from leafy greens, for example, we get microfats and microproteins that are sufficient for the body to run on.
I
Yeah,
love that. And you mentioned glucose. It was a topic that I just wanted to mention because many people are like, oh, no sugar, no sugar, no sugar, no sugar. And I'm thinking, because not all sugars are equal, right? I mean, there's the white sugar, which is probably more addictive than cocaine. And then there's sugar from fruits. And you've mentioned glucose several times in this
sure.
discussion. So what's your take on sugar, glucose,
Yeah.
as sugar as a source of glucose? Because I suppose you can get it from other things as well.
Yeah, so glucose, when I say glucose, I'm referring to glucose from good sources, so glucose from fruits, glucose from vegetables. This is essential glucose that the body needs to function. If we don't have glucose, the vital organs will go into shutdown. So the body is always prioritizing getting glucose from somewhere. If it's not getting it from the foods that are coming into the body, it's going to start taking it from the body from other places, basically. So getting enough glucose in our diet is absolutely critical. It's critical. So people who are on a paleo diet or on a ketogenic diet, for example, this can have benefits in the shorter term, often because they're getting rid of all the processed foods. And it can sort of help to normalize things and help people lose weight in the shorter time. But it's also putting a huge amount of pressure on the organs like the liver and the kidneys and the heart, because those organs are still having to process very high levels of fat. Mm-hmm. So getting glucose from fruits and vegetables is critical. And there's there's so much fear around eating fruit. We don't need to fear eating fruit as long as we're eating it in the right way, ideally not with fats, so that the body can take up that glucose and that glucose is not being blocked by the fats. Also important to just mention that sugar addiction is often quite valid, in the sense that the body is crying out for something. If somebody is very, very addicted to sugar, it's because their body and their brain is asking for glucose. It's a cry for glucose. And what's often in the way of the body getting that glucose that it needs is the fat. So when you start taking away the fat and giving the body the glucose that it needs, then it can start to recover. Obviously, eating refined sugar is not ideal because you're not getting the nutrients that you need. You're getting empty calories. You're getting an empty source of glucose. So this is never gonna be the answer to healing, But that intense craving for sugar, this is coming from the body's genuine need for glucose.
I love that. So how does fat block the use of glucose? Is it just because as a priority, the body will deal with the fat first? Because you've mentioned that a few times. I'm thinking,
So every time we eat fat, the body produces insulin from the pancreas, and that insulin is in charge of pulling the glucose into the cells. But what fat will do is block that uptake. So it prevents insulin from moving the glucose into the cells in an effective manner. So what you get is this buildup of glucose in the blood, and it's not going anywhere, which increases your blood glucose levels and makes people think, oh God, I'm eating too much sugar, I'm eating too much glucose. But actually the problem is the fat.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so 3 things to stop doing. You said stop the junk food, right? You definitely then said stop the food combinations that are high fat and high protein, all in one. And then you
high fat, high protein, and high sugar. You don't want to be combining high fats with high sugar.
Right.
So if you're going to eat a high protein diet, then you would want to be eating very low carbohydrates, because the two don't mix together. So people will go one of 2 routes. They'll go on a high protein / high fat diet and low carbohydrate, or they'll go on a high carbohydrate, low fat, low protein approach. And both of those can have positive effects. But the one that will have positive effects in the longer term for our longevity will be the high glucose stroke carbohydrate, low fat, because it's what looks after the body and the organs in the most appropriate way.
Interesting. And this is across all blood groups. It doesn't really depend on whether you're O positive and all of the business.
No.
A body is a body.
It's how the body works physiologically.
Very fascinating.
Yeah, but that said, it doesn't mean, you know, I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to cut out animal food and all proteins. You know, there is a way to eat those foods that is in harmony. You know, for example, having a small amount of animal food at the end of the day, where you have filled up with lots of fruits and vegetables throughout the day with very, very low levels of fat, for example. So there's ways that we can eat, you know, our protein. If we enjoy animal protein, for example, that's okay. It's okay to eat it, you know, but it's just how we're eating it is important to consider.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's
and
also
how much.
exactly. I was just going to the proportions, how much, and I think we all have to explore and find where the sweet spot is for our bodies, right? As I've been vegan and vegetarian for long periods of time, and in the end, my body's like, "Ooh, I want some," and I give it some, and it feels happy. I don't have to eat animal protein every day, not at all. And sometimes it wants some, so I'm like, okay, as you said, if it's craving something, then why not? And how about things we can start doing? What are the 3 things you would say? Absolutely. Brain health. What do you want to start doing?
Eat more fruit. Eat more fruit for its glucose content. Eat more leafy greens for its trace minerals. And start the heavy metal detox smoothie.
Awesome. That's really good. And everybody can start that. I mean, it's pretty easy.
That can be found. I mean, if you Google heavy metal detox smoothie, you can easily find the recipe for that.
Exactly. Yeah. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. That's I've learned a lot, especially the thing about the scented candles, by the way.
Yeah. Take action.
Oh my! And the thing you said about fragrances as well, but you know, we could have a totally different discussion on that, because you can't go anywhere without
mind-blowing
smelling someone's fragrance. You know, you're toxified by default. Thank you so much, Rebecca. This has been really useful, very
You're
helpful.
so welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Thank you so much.